This program was made possible by grants from Bruce R. Sullivan, Esquire, from the Donald W. and Ann A. Eberly Charitable Foundation, and from the Steamship Historical Society of America. Additional funding was provided by the following contributors.
September 1971, the great sidewheel steamboat Alexander Hamilton makes her last passenger run on the Hudson River. Captured here by the camera of William Ewen, the Hamilton's sheer lines and graceful profile were still evident even at the end of her 47 years of service. The Hamilton's last trip marked not only the end for a proud riverboat, but also the end of an era, the grand finale of the famous Hudson River Dayline, and the end of over 150 years of passenger steamboats on the Hudson. As boats saluted the Hamilton on her way down the river that September day, one of the reluctant witnesses was maritime artist Bill Muller.
What made these old steamers so compelling and attracted my eye so much as an artist is just the sheer artistry of these things. They're just things of beauty, objects of beauty. And even to the very end, in a more simplified form, steamers like the Alexander Hamilton carried forward the tradition and the grace, that wonderful sweeping sheer line, which sets a ship like that apart from any other man-made object.
Growing up along the Hudson, Bill Muller had known the Alexander Hamilton all his life. He had lived out a childhood dream in the early 1950s when he signed on, first as apprentice and then as a pilot, aboard this grand steamer. And though those Dayline days are memories now, Muller maintains a connection to his time on the river and commemorates the age of the Hudson steamboats through his painting.
These were wonderful creations, truly wonderful things. They gave total delight and comfort to the people that traveled on them. The brisk air, the Hudson River, splendid scenery, the sounds of the flag snapping overhead, the steady beat of the paddle wheels if you're down below where you might hear a bit of that, maybe the sounds of the orchestra drifting up through the decks. Wonderful enchantment. What's better?
The 150 years of steam navigation on the Hudson would see a great parade of history pass by. It was here that the modern age of mechanized transportation began. Here that great riverboats would arrive and vanish. And here that the Hudson River dayboats and nightboats would carry generations of travelers to their riverside destinations. All this played out against the backdrop of one of the most beautiful river valleys in the world, the lordly Hudson. To understand the historical impact of developments on the Hudson River, you first need to understand its geography. This is no ordinary river. For most of its southern length, the Hudson is actually an extended tidal estuary, an arm of the sea. The river's current moves in both directions, ebbing and flowing daily with the movements of the tides, an effect felt as far north as Troy, 160 miles upstream. While the Hudson was a traditional avenue of trade for Native Americans, the year 1609 was notable for the arrival of the Dutch exploration ship Half Moon, captained by the English navigator who would give the river his name, Henry Hudson. Hudson's expedition marked the beginnings of European colonization in the Hudson watershed, and within 50 years, the Dutch had established a presence in the city of New Amsterdam at the mouth of the river. Renamed New York after its capture by the English in 1664, the city soon became a major commercial center. Like most colonial settlements, New York depended on waterways, and no route was more important than the one upriver to a trading center first called Fort Orange by the Dutch and later renamed Albany by the English. A century later, in 1800, just 20 years into the new American nationhood, sail power was still the driving force connecting the thriving river towns of Albany and New York. Rough roads made land travel difficult, so Hudson River sloops, or packet boats, delivered mail, passengers, and freight as quickly as the wind and tides would allow, but with somewhat unpredictable schedules.
If you wanted to go from Albany to New York, you took a stagecoach. It took days to get down there. You'd get stuck in the mud. You'd have to stop and change horses all the time. It was very expensive. You never were sure when you could arrive. If you took one of the sloops, they often stopped, the sloops stopped because there was no wind. And people would get off and pick berries and have a little picnic, or they'd get off and they would spend a couple of days waiting for the wind to come up, and sometimes it would take 5 days to get to New York.
So it was in December 1806 that an American artist, inventor, and amateur engineer returned to New York from an extended stay in England and France. A dreamer, visionary, and ceaseless self-promoter, Robert Fulton had thrown himself into an array of grand projects to change the world. Canal building, submarine warfare, and now steam-powered navigation. While in Paris, Fulton had met Robert Livingston, where Livingston, as American ambassador, had just negotiated the Louisiana Purchase. Chancellor Livingston was an influential figure in New York politics and a shrewd businessman, for he had managed to secure monopoly rights from the New York legislature for running steam vessels in all New York state waters. Their partnership, however, entered a crowded field.
The invention of the steam engine is generally attributed to James Watt of England in the late 1760s. And after that, there was great interest on both sides of the Atlantic in trying to adapt the steam engine to transportation. In this country, John Fitch had built 2 or 3 operating steamboats, operated for short distances, and they were small, but to bring any idea really into fruition, you have to have 2 things. You have to have the idea and then the necessary finances to bring it about.
There's a long list of people who had successful small steamboats, many of them here in the United States. Symington had one, Maury had one up on the Connecticut River, and he even took one steamboat from Hartford to New York and back well before Robert Fulton's time. But none of this was really of a commercial size or dependability that you could keep an established schedule on.
And here lay one of the keys to Robert Fulton's genius, a great business sense and a fierce desire to do something grand, to make a mark in the world.
I think that the important thing about Robert Fulton is that, one, he had a great vision, that he persevered, that he was an enormous enthusiast, that he got beaten down and would pop right up again and work at something, that he thought of every detail. And he bought the calico that was to go in the windows of the ship because he wanted to make sure that it was right and that it was elegant.
With Livingston's political and financial support and much of his own money, Fulton completed construction of his steam vessel in the spring of 1807.
At the outset, it was named the North River Steamboat, and the home of the Livingston in the Hudson Valley was at a place called Claremont, and the Claremont was used as the home port of the vessel. And on an August day in 1870, set out with the North River Steamboat and 24 hours later, regardless of the way the tide was flowing or the winds, it moored off of Claremont so the Livingston presumably could see what their monetary contributions had brought about.
The connection to Livingston's estate had an unanticipated result. Contemporary historians mistakenly gave the North River Steamboat the name of her home port, Claremont, and so we know her today. In any event, the steamboat resumed her trip the following afternoon and arrived in Albany with a total running time port to port of just under 32 hours. While we know the rough dimensions of Fulton's landmark vessel, 142 feet long, 14 feet wide, 4-foot draft, there are no known contemporary plans or drawings of the boat. This watercolor from the New York Historical Society is supposedly a documented representation of the boat after she was modified in 1808. But it was made some 40 years after the fact, long after the boat had disappeared. In 1909, a full-sized replica of the North River Steamboat was built for the Hudson-Fulton Centennial celebration, and while it gives another view of what the North River Steamboat may have looked like, it too was based on speculation. What we do know is that the North River Steamboat's engine was not Fulton's invention. While he may have created his own gearing and paddle wheel mechanisms, the steamboat's engine was purchased from the noted Bolt & Watt firm in England and shipped to the United States under Fulton's instructions. Patent diagrams suggest that the steamboat's driving mechanism worked something like this. Generating about 24 horsepower, the engine propelled the steamboat at a speed of about 4 miles per hour, or slightly faster than a brisk walk. The North River Steamboat of Claremont proved remarkably reliable, and Fulton, with his gift for self-promotion, now advertised her services widely. Over the next 6 years, Fulton continued his quest for empire, building faster, more luxurious vessels, each one better than the one before. His unrelenting efforts took their toll, however, and in February 1815, following an ill-advised midwinter visit to his boatyard, Fulton developed pneumonia and went into a rapid decline.
Unhappily, Fulton died in the midst of his setting up his steamboat empire. But what he left behind was an army of people who saw that this was possible, and the steamboats proliferated.
With his expansive vision, Fulton may have had some inkling of how important his invention was, but the impact of this first commercially successful engine-driven vessel was remarkable.
The steamboat is the forgotten instrument in the development of American commerce, and it facilitated the opening up of inland points, along, particularly in conjunction with the completion of the Erie Canal.
Transportation, reliable transportation, is the secret to trade. So that it really transformed American life and the life of the world.
Flash forward some 85 years. New York City has changed dramatically. The industrial age that the steamboat helped create has changed the very pace of life itself. The arrival of the new 20th century finds New York, once a rugged post-colonial port city, now a bustling metropolis. The biggest, most vibrant city in a nation on the verge of greatness. And just as the city has changed, so too has the neighboring Hudson River. The harbor is now a swirl of tugboats, freighters, ocean liners, and of course, steamboats. Even in this emerging modern age, the Hudson River steamboats are still the grandest way to travel upstate. And the famous Hudson River Dayline steamers have firmly established themselves as the best of the best, making the Dayline one of the premier transportation companies in America. But the line's road to greatness had been paved by the work of many others. Early steamboat development quickened dramatically beginning in 1824, when the United States Supreme Court invalidated the Fulton-Livingston Company's exclusivity. After 17 years of monopoly, interstate commerce was essentially deregulated, and competitors were free to sail in all New York waters.
At the end of the 1820s, Steamboats had essentially the characteristics that they were to carry right through to the end of the steamboat era. I mean, the physical characteristics, the boats themselves.
The boats were dependable. They soon got up to a fairly good speed, 18 miles an hour by the 1830s. That was the standard speed, and that's because of the wave action on hulls. That's still the practical speed for powered ships today to run economically.
Two other developments bolstered the steamboat business. The opening of the Erie Canal brought an influx of freight from the west, and the first of the mountaintop hotels opened in the Catskills, foreshadowing a tourist business that would be fully unleashed in the 1880s and 90s. For its time, the steamboat business was a fast way to entrepreneurial riches, and ambitious men responded to the potential for either great wealth or a fast buck.
There was great competition on the river in the early years for this thing, and the boats would race and sometimes blow up and have fires and so on. And gradually the guys were cutting prices so badly it was like the airline thing today. It got to the point there was no money and they formed associations, but there was always some bad boy breaking out of the association and lowering the fares with either a super cheap boat or a faster boat or something or other.
One of the bad boys who challenged the established order was Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, who took on the monopolistic Hudson River Steamboat Association in a fierce rate war. Unable to intimidate him, the association was eventually forced to buy him out, setting a pattern that would be repeated many times over. Another feisty, free-swinging transportation tycoon, Daniel Drew, followed Vanderbilt, launching a rival service somewhat disingenuously named the People's Line. In 1836, Drew introduced a fast new night boat, the Rochester, which set a new speed record from New York to Albany of just under 9 hours. In the mid-river port of Rondout, two more competing steamboat owners came onto the scene during the 1830s, Thomas Cornell and Abraham Van Santvoord. Van Santvoord ran converted passenger steamers as towboats and launched the Oswego, the first large side-wheel vessel built specifically for towing work on the Hudson. Thomas Cornell, besides starting a night boat service, also secured exclusive rights to the Delaware and Hudson coal trade. His Cornell Tugboat Company would grow to become the largest towboat business on the river.
Pretty quickly they went over to a system of towboats, which were basically older steamboats that had been outmoded or surpassed by faster boats. The freight business was extremely important because that's how food got to New York City, building materials, which were a huge part of the freight that traveled on the Hudson River, and coal, the anthracite coal from Pennsylvania. So it was a very important business.
With both passenger and freight business booming, Daniel Drew's People's Line launched a series of impressive new night boats, beginning with the Isaac Newton in 1845, the Hendrick Hudson, and in 1847, the giant 353-foot New World. The following decade ushered in other changes too. A rail link between New York and Albany was finally completed as the Hudson River Railroad pushed through on the East Shore. And the summer tourist business boomed as the Catskill hotels increased their popularity, as more and more of the growing middle class found time for leisure. A mere 50 years after Fulton's landmark North River steamboat, the technology and grandeur of steam transportation had already reached dazzling heights. The stage was now fully set for the coming Gilded Age of steam and the rise of the Hudson's most famous steamboat line of all, the Hudson River Day Line. Long a thoroughfare for travel and commerce, the Hudson River Valley positively reverberated with the sounds of the thriving steamboat business of the mid-1800s. In the years following Robert Fulton's North River steamboat, the valley had seen the arrival of faster, more advanced, and more luxurious boats, and the rise of an excursion business that would flourish in the coming decades.
I have sailed the Danube and the Rhine, and to my opinion, I may be biased, but nothing compares with the Hudson River Valley's beauty.
Even as a riverman who traveled her regularly, former Dayline pilot Jack Hamilton was struck by the continual beauty of the Hudson. Whether in 1860, 1910, or even today, the Hudson remains one of the great river journeys in the world. By the 1840s and 50s, this trip had already become a must-see excursion for European visitors to America, as well as a summertime tradition for local travelers. Because of its scenic appeal, the river served as subject matter for painters, photographers, or in this case, for the very first filmmakers. This early Biograph silent film, shot in 1903, shows a boat's eye view of a trip up the Hudson, as it would have been seen from the decks of a Hudson River steamer. And remarkably, the panorama along the way, like this view around Dunderberg Mountain approaching Anthony's Nose, remains much the same today as it did nearly a century ago, when great steamboats headed north from New York for Albany and points along the way. Though their departures are far less frequent now, passenger boats still pull away from the piers of Midtown Manhattan for the trip up the Hudson, just as they did some 50 or even 150 years ago. For generations, great steamboats of the Hudson River Dayline departed from these very docks along the lower west side of New York, beginning their daily trip either from the Des Rosses Street Pier or later from the 42nd Street Pier seen here. The early morning passage up the North River is a quieter journey for the occasional tourboat now than it was 100 years ago, when the lower Hudson was teeming with traffic and activity. But even today, the views are striking. As the skyline of New York recedes, the arching George Washington Bridge comes into view. Completed in 1931, the bridge has been in existence long enough to have seen the last of the steamboats, like the dayliner Alexander Hamilton, passing under her span here. Then as now, the bridge served as a gateway to the journey up the lower Hudson River. The New Jersey Palisades come into stark relief just north of the bridge. For 150 years, their rock wall has provided a scenic backdrop for the imagery that marks the eras of Hudson steamboating. Like so many other landmarks along the way, the Palisades reflect the surprising constancy of the Hudson's natural geography. Traveling the broad, timeless expanse of the Tappan Zee today, it is still possible to imagine the now vanished steamboats pushing along at their fast 20-knot cruising speed through open water.
The Hudson is always changing. We used to call it the River of Lakes because you go so far and then there's a bend and you turn and then there's another lake. And then you only see so far, and this continues all the way to Albany.
Past the towns of Verplanck and Fishkill, the river enters the Hudson Highlands, for countless travelers, the highlight of a Hudson River journey. The bold fjord-like passage through the weathered backbone of the Appalachian chain takes the traveler by Bear Mountain, long a stopping point for day trippers. For generations, the wooded pleasure park here and downriver at Indian Point provided an escape from the sweltering city, a place for picnicking, swimming, walking, and other recreation. Farther north, at Kingston Point, a similar pleasure park serves summer visitors from Albany and points along the upper river. Many people have fond memories of their summer trips on the river. These 8mm tourist clips show how captivated passengers were by the steamboat experience. Long Island resident Stanley Lair took these movies of his family during a dayline outing to West Point in the 1960s. But he also remembers taking the Hudson River dayline when he was a boy, some 30 years earlier.
For me, being a poor child, my parents didn't have much. I felt very rich for a day with this experience, and I felt that this was my ocean liner. This was not just the Hudson River dayline. This was a wish fulfillment taking place for me, that the ship could be anything I wanted it to be in my imagination, and that's why I loved it so much.
Lair conveys the magic that a trip on the Hudson could bring. And through the years, passengers would take in the river scenery in many ways and on many different boats. And no time was more dramatic or romantic than the golden age of steam that began in the 1860s. While America was racked with turmoil during the turbulent years of the Civil War, on the Hudson, the decade of the 1860s would mark the opening of a new era. Supplying the Union war effort had been profitable for Alfred Van Santvoord, son of towboat magnate Abraham Van Santvoord, and in 1863 he would form a new partnership to run steamers between New York and Albany. Typical of the wheeling and dealing of the Hudson steamboat business, the partnership would first squelch competition by purchasing their main potential rival, the Daniel Drew, a fast 3-year-old dayboat, and then acquire a slightly older vessel, the Armenia, to pair with the Drew. In 1864, the group commissioned a brand new steamboat, the Chauncey Fibbard, adding an impressive flagship to their growing fleet. Initially called simply the Day Line of Steamers on the Hudson River, the new company was on its way to becoming one of the premier transportation companies in America. The Civil War years saw another new player on the Hudson River, a graceful vessel that would take its place as one of the most beloved and honored steamboats in Hudson history, the famous Mary Powell.
Mabie Absalom Anderson was one of the 3 steamboat operators operating out of the run-out section of Kingston. The original boat, as built and launched, was somewhat of a disappointment. She didn't achieve the speed that Absalom Anderson had hoped for. So the following year, after she was launched, she had her hauled out and actually cut in 2 and lengthened by pulling the forward part and the after part apart. And that added length helped the vessel a great deal as far as her speed was concerned.
The reconfigured boat has been declared the perfect design for her time. Besides her nearly ideal proportions, several elements combine to make the Mary Powell the quintessential Hudson River steamboat. Like most of the Hudson steamers that came before her, her boilers were placed out under the cantilevered guards, as shown in this diagram of a similar boat from that era. Carrying boilers out over the guards offered more space amidships, and especially in the early years, some assurance that if a boiler exploded, it might just roll safely off into the river. The Mary Powell featured a Fletcher Harrison & Company walking beam engine, similar to this one found on the mid-size lake steamer Ticonderoga, driving twin side-wheel paddles. Starting a beam engine was done by hand, with the engineer manually admitting steam to the upper and lower valves in sequence, as seen on this diagram from a similar boat. Once the engine was up to speed, the hooks were dropped, and an automatic valving system took over. On many of the steamers, glass windows looked down on the internal workings of the engine, or you could sit on the top deck and relax to the rocking of the giant iron beam. Many a passenger, young and old, whiled away the hours, absorbed in the rhythms of these great mechanisms. While the Mary Powell may have ruled as the Queen of the Hudson, other new steamboats came onto the river in the 1860s as well. In 1864, Thomas Cornell, successor to his uncle's towboat business, launched a passenger boat as his namesake, the Thomas Cornell, sailing out of Rondout, which ran as a night boat carrying freight as well as passengers. At the same time, the Albany to New York People's Line upgraded its fleet of night boats with 3 new steamers, beginning with a mammoth 393-foot-long St. John, the 348-foot steamer Dean Richmond, and the 366-foot Drew. All launched in the mid-1860s, they were each more than a football field long, and in the case of the St. John, larger than many ocean liners of that day. Not to be confused with the dayboat Daniel Drew, the Drew, like her sister ships, featured 2 tiers of staterooms accommodating nearly 1,000 passengers, all opening out onto an elaborately ornate 2-story grand saloon. Elegantly outfitted throughout, like floating hotels, these night boats made the journey from Albany to New York in about 9 hours, which proved to be an ideal length for an overnight trip. Passengers had time for dinner and socializing before turning in, arriving refreshed and ready for business the next morning. During this golden age of steam on the Hudson, there were scores of steamboats crisscrossing the river. In fact, having your own boat line, no matter how small, was a matter of local pride. It seemed as if every little river town and landing had some kind of steamboat operation. There were mid-sized operations like the Catskill Evening Line with the well-known Onteora and Catterskill offering regular service to New York, or the Saugerties Evening Line with the steamers Saugerties and Ulster. Other smaller operations provided local service, carrying passengers and freight on short hops between the smaller riverside communities. These boats made stops at all the local landings, offering frequent schedules and adding to the buzz of activity that swept the Hudson River in the late 1800s. The year 1880 saw yet another great leap forward when the Hudson River Day Line launched the new steamboat, Albany. The Albany was the first major steamboat constructed for the river with an iron hull, and she marked the beginning of the Day Line's distinctive 3-stack design. Initially 284 feet long, the boat was lengthened in 1892 and modernized. Note the replacement of her original ornate paddle boxes with the more contemporary false window treatment. The Albany featured another popular innovation, as her dining room was moved out of the hold and placed above deck at the stern, offering the splendid river scenery as a pleasant backdrop to the line's well-respected meal service. The Albany was joined in 1887 by a sister ship, appropriately named for the other terminus of the Day Line route, the 301-foot steamer New York.
They were very similar. The Albany was the older boat. They both had 3 smokestacks, thwartships, beam engines. The New York had her stacks forward of the walking beam. The Albany had them aft. But they were very fast and a very nice small fleet for the Day Line.
The so-called floating iron palaces ran opposite each other for the remainder of the century, setting a standard for quality that competitors found nearly impossible to match. This photograph of the New York sitting at the pier at Kingston Point is one of the classic steamboat images from the Gilded Age. By 1900, Alfred Van Santvoort had passed operation of the Day Line into the hands of his son-in-law, Eben Alcott. Though the Day Line's 2 main boats still ran only from May to October, between them they were carrying some 250,000 passengers a year. E. Alcott determined that the time was right for a new boat to meet demand. 2 years in the process, the new vessel, to be called the Hendrick Hudson, was ready for launching in the spring of 1906 at the Thomas S. Marvel Shipyard in Newburgh, New York. Perhaps influenced by the temperance-minded Mrs. Alcott, the boat was officially christened with a bottle of Catskill Mountain water, a breach of shipbuilding tradition that did not sit well with her builder.
Thomas Marvel really refused to launch a vessel without a proper christening with a bottle of champagne. Came time for the launching. Thomas Marvel was not up on the launching platform as he should have been, maybe, but he worked his way around to the after end of the boat, well out of sight of the launching platform and E. Alcott, and climbed under there, and just as soon as she started to move, he whacked this bottle of champagne against the side of the hull, and she had a proper christening.
The Hendrick Hudson was a rare combination of size and grace. 379 feet long, and when completed in July 1907, elegantly decorated with fine woodwork, spacious interiors, and tasteful decor. She was powered by a 3-cylinder compound steam engine generating over 6,000 horsepower, a modern design that would appear on several subsequent Dayline steamers, including the Alexander Hamilton, as seen here.
There were only three. I think there were only three perfect steamboats built. One was the Hendrick Hudson. Second one was Tashmoo on the lakes. And the third one was Mary Powell.
The Hendrick Hudson had raised the standards of river travel yet another notch. She was a warm and comfortable place for the traveling public, and travel they did, on many weekends filling the decks and lounges of the great steamboat to near her 5,600 passenger capacity. As the century turned and the 1900s began, the Hudson River Dayline seemed poised to begin a new period of unprecedented popularity. Traffic was steadily rising. A great new steamer had just joined the fleet, and the line had firmly established its reputation. A trip on the Hudson was a much-anticipated summertime experience, and more, an appreciative public was turning to the great steamers of the Dayline for recreation. Who could know that the line was nearing its high point, and that the beginning of the end to an era was just around the corner? The 20th century would prove to be an uncertain era for steamboating on the Hudson. The great new steamers of the Hudson River Dayline would carry millions of passengers, a number unimagined even a few decades earlier. But the Dayline, now clearly premier among the Hudson steamboat operations, would also suffer great misfortune and see the slow decline of the great age of steam. In all the frenetic growth of the 1920s and 30s, however, it was hard to imagine that this business would ever end.
Oh, there was the Hudson River Dayline was doing a big business in those days. Yeah, a ticket from Kingston Point to New York was $1.65. On Saturdays and Sundays, I took in as much as $4,000 and $5,000. I was cooped up in a little bit of an office, and I had the door closed and locked. And when you come up with your money, I just took the bill change and threw it on the floor. I didn't have time to separate it at all.
Though Bill Spangenberger was working during the early Depression years of the 1930s, the periods before and after would see even higher traffic for the day line, with the most dramatic increase coming from 1910 to 1925. In many ways, the Hudson River Day Line was in the best position it had ever been in. The company was financially sound, and the fleet was growing. With the new Hendrick Hudson sailing alongside the established steamers Albany and New York, the line averaged nearly 300,000 passengers in the summer of 1908. But the close of that 1908 season was marked not by triumph, but by tragedy. Tied up for barely 24 hours at the end of her summer tour, the great steamer New York caught fire on the night of October 20th, and by morning had burned to the waterline, a total loss. The demise of the New York left the company a boat short just 6 months from the start of the long-awaited Hudson-Fulton celebration, a national event expected to bring a banner crop of summer travelers. The decision was quickly made to replace her, and in an unprecedented 4.5 months, the Day Line designed, built, and launched the 330-foot steamboat Robert Fulton. To accelerate the schedule and keep costs down, the Day Line had chosen to reuse the New York's 20-year-old beam engine, which had been salvaged from the wreck.
They put the beam engine of the New York and 3 stacks into the Fulton, walking beam, of course, and she became a very popular boat.
Whether by premeditated design or not, the company had created a boat built in 1909 that featured the look of 1889. A happy turn of fate that would make the Robert Fulton one of the most beloved steamboats on the Hudson for nearly 50 years. The Robert Fulton was put in service in late May of 1909, in plenty of time for the Hudson-Fulton festivities. Marking the 300th anniversary of Henry Hudson's exploration and the centennial of Fulton's first steamboat, the celebration was highlighted by a great naval parade up the river. The new steamer took a prominent place in the squadron of steamboats, joining warships, yachts, tugboats, and even the authentic working replica of Fulton's North River steamboat. Next off the drawing boards would be the largest steamboat the line would build, the massive Washington Irving. 400 feet long, capable of carrying an astounding 6,500 passengers. She was one of the largest steamboats afloat when she was launched in 1913. This was steamboating on a scale that reflected the expansive vision of the American century: grand, powerful, bigger, and better. Ironically, the Irving's inaugural trip would be overshadowed by the maiden voyage of the bigger and more grandiose night boat, the Berkshire.
The Berkshire of the Night Line, which was their largest vessel, a beam engine side-wheeler, was 440 feet long, which is a substantial length, and she was probably the largest riverboat ever built.
This photo from early 1913 offers a rare view of the Berkshire and Irving tied up together at the pier in Albany. Because they ran opposite schedules, one running by day, the other by night, they would rarely cross paths on the river. In another ironic twist, the demise of both these great steamers is foreshadowed by another interloper. Early automobiles and trucks can be seen in the lower half of the picture, harbingers of a new mode of transportation that would eventually spell the end to the age of steam on the Hudson. Between 1918 and 1920, day line traffic expanded dramatically by over 50% to almost 1.5 million passengers. Breaking with tradition, the line acquired an existing steamer, a 7-year-old propeller vessel that was renamed the DeWitt Clinton. The Clinton also represented the line's first departure from paddle wheel propulsion, and her more restrained renovations reflected another change in company direction. The day line was now becoming more a means of mass transportation and less a vehicle for refined vacationing. Another new boat joined the fleet in 1924 when the line launched the 338-foot Alexander Hamilton as a partner boat for the older Robert Fulton. The Hamilton featured the more traditional paddle wheel propulsion, but was driven by a modern oil-fired triple expansion engine. To better serve increased demand for charter service, the line purchased the small propeller steamer Chauncey Depew in 1925, and would later commission a larger propeller-driven steamboat, the Peter Stuyvesant, in 1927, a boat that would see varied service through the 1950s. The day of June 1st, 1926 rose gray and hazy, perhaps an ominous sign. The giant steamer Washington Irving was the upboat this quiet Monday, and as she slowly headed out of her berth at Desbrosses Street, disaster struck.
And the Washington Irving came out of the pier in a real hazy day that day. And she was rammed by a Moran tug and barge. And Captain Deming, he took the vessel and set her on the Holland Tunnel over in the Hoboken side, Jersey City area there.
Captain David Deming had been able to steer the crippled steamer across the river to the Jersey side, where the massive Irving slowly settled into the mud up to her third deck. Though the boat was lightly loaded, in the resulting confusion 3 lives were lost, 1 crewman and 2 passengers, the only passenger fatalities in the line's 100 years of operation. With her frame twisted, the Irving was a total loss, the sad end for what had become the flagship of the Dayline fleet. The loss of the Washington Irving and the burning of the New York some 20 years earlier were 2 of the darker days for the Dayline. But with constant round-the-clock traffic, accidents had always been a part of Hudson steamboating. Other lines saw their share of disasters, some tragic, some more ironic. It's surprising that groundings and collisions were not more frequent, but happen they did, especially in the early spring and at the end of the season in late fall, when fogs were common along the river. And collisions like this one between the night boats Adirondack and Saratoga were remarkable as much for their rarity as for their drama. With seamanship so important to safe operation, steamboats depended on a skilled professional crew. For rivermen all up and down the Hudson, working on the passenger steamers, especially the Dayline, was the ultimate assignment, an honor much sought after, and for many, the pinnacle of a maritime career. The Dayline officers represented the height of the profession, and their experience and river savvy were essential to boat operation, especially when you consider that throughout the line's history, the giant steamers would be operated without the help of any electronic navigational aids.
We ran on the same procedures that the old Mary Powell of the 1860s operated.
We simply had a magnetic compass. We ran courses on time, and we used whistle echoes from points we should be when we would change courses. I am amazed myself today as how the night boats and the Cornell flotilla tows were able to get up and down the river in foggy weather, but they did.
I would log the time it took the vessel to cover a specific stretch of the trip and log in what the compass course is for that stretch of river, how many minutes of running time in accordance with the state of the tide. So when we had thick fog or heavy rain or whatever, we would always maintain our speed, invariably, but we knew that we would steer a particular course, say north by east, a quarter east. We would run that course for about 7 minutes.
And we're at a ice house. So we get an echo off the ice house. And then our next thing we're supposed to hit would be some big building of some type. And we time our course to that point. And then we blow the whistle until we get that echo off the next unit.
And that's the way we really operated these steamers, knowing our headings for so many minutes and according to the tide and our speed and so forth.
Just as navigating the proper channel required special knowledge, So too did the maneuvering required to make the half-dozen or more landings per trip.
You have to remember that the day line ran by the clock. They didn't run by the tide tables. So you'd have flood tide at one landing, and a few days later you'd have ebb tide and so forth, and it was quite a different way of handling the boat.
Bringing a giant side-wheel steamer like the Robert Fulton or the Alexander Hamilton into dock was a carefully choreographed routine, varying according to the set of tide and current. From their vantage point down below, the engineering department was especially critical of a captain's abilities.
The amount of activity that the engineer gets is in direct proportion to the skill of the captain. We had some good captains and we had some lemons. I was on the Peter Stuyvesant after I had left the vessel. I made a trip one day going up the Hudson, and he took half an hour to land at Yonkers. He missed the landing completely, turned 360 degrees and tried again, and just about missed it the second time. When we were on the Peter Stuyvesant, we had a fellow named George Carroll as captain, and I have never seen a better man on a boat. This man could drive nails with the boat, as the old saying goes. If the wind and conditions were right, that is, the tidal conditions in the river, I have seen him land the Peter Stuyvesant with one astern bell. We had portholes on the port side. We stood on the starboard side of the engine, and there were portholes in both port and starboard, and we could just see out one of the port side ports in the engine room, and we'd get the stop bell, and we'd look out this port, and all of a sudden we'd see the spiles of the dock go whizzing by. The telegraph would ring half astern. We would back, the engine's churning away. He would ring stop, and we were there.
Though traffic was falling off, the 1930s saw the dayboats continue to maintain their popularity. An outing to the parks at Bear Mountain or Kingston Point or Indian Point provided a weekend escape from the harsh realities of the Depression years. For the night boats, however, the decline was faster. The Hudson Nightline was acquiring an unsavory reputation, and for some passengers at least, had become a place for an escape of a different kind.
I guess there were groups of women who traveled back and forth day and night on those boats to make a little money. I probably shouldn't mention it, but I recall one night when I was going up, they had a bar. This was after Prohibition had been lifted. And there weren't too many people at the bar. There was a man with two young women, and they left before I did. And when I went up to my stateroom, I was walking through one of the upper decks, and I heard these two women laughing, and one of them said, "Let's take his pants down."
By the late 1930s, through travel to Albany was being siphoned off by the automobile, impacting the river traffic in a way the railroads never had. World War II and gas rationing slowed this change, and for several years, the Dayline's traffic returned.
The Dayline had a great surge of traffic during the war because of automobile gasoline rationing and so forth. So the boats were running at capacity during the war years. But once the war was over, the business just dropped precipitously. And the first victim of that decline was the laying up of the Hendrick Hudson, the big stalwart of the Dayline fleet.
In 1948, with ticket sales and profitability buried by a new flood of automobile traffic, Alfred Van Santvoort Alcott, son of Eben Alcott, made the reluctant decision to sell the Dayline to a tour operator. The Hendrick Hudson, judged too large for the market, was retired, and running a smaller fleet, the new Dayline hung on through the 1950s. As the excursion business waned, however, the Robert Fulton was also removed from service, and then the Peter Stuyvesant. The Alexander Hamilton soldiered on, and many families took advantage of these summer voyages in the late 50s and 60s. The Hamilton would make a regular daily trip up to Poughkeepsie, turning around in mid-river without stopping, and return, making landings only at Newburgh, West Point, and Bear Mountain. This operation would finally end, and the resurrected Day Line made its last passenger trip on Labor Day 1971, ending a proud tradition of steamboats on the Hudson.
It was very sad for me to have witnessed the decline of the line. From my boyhood years of watching these beautifully maintained big white steamers with all the polished brass and the gold leaf lettering and the orchestras and the carpeting and all of those wonderful amenities, the fine dining rooms. This was a tradition that was uninterrupted from the time that Robert Fulton put his North River steamboat, commonly called Claremont, on the river in 1807, and for every summer until that Labor Day night of 1971, we had an unending period of sidewheel steamboats on the Hudson River, a wonderful tradition.
What drove the great attachment that passengers and crew held for these boats? The old Day Line veterans will tell you that there was something almost alive in the pulse of a steam engine, a feeling reinforced by the tangible physical connection between these inanimate pieces of machinery and the men who operated them.
The steam engine is a very labor-intensive machine. It is also, in a sense, this may sound a little corny, but it's also a very human machine. It requires you to touch it. It requires you to do things to it. The oiler, for example, is in continuous contact with every part of the machine. You could hear and feel what the engine was doing. And of course it was visual. You had this huge thing standing there with all of these parts moving around and in beautiful precision, every part following exactly behind every other part. And they also had a distinctive sound. Every engine has its own distinctive sound, whether it was a pounding or a chuffing or a clicking. The steam going in and out of the cylinder would whoosh or chuff, and all the various little parts which may be just a little bit slack or something, they all had little clicks and rattles. So you got to know what that sound was, and if that sound changed, you immediately recognized it. But all of your senses were in contact with the steam engine. Hearing, smelling, feeling. So again, there was an empathy, if you will, between the man and the engine.
Though the Hudson remains a working river, a thoroughfare for barges and freight, and a resource for small boat recreation, there are no more steamboats to travel this waterway as they did for over 150 years. Looking out on the broad expanse of the Tappan Zee, or around the bend at West Point, or through the gates of Storm King and Breakneck Ridge, it's not hard to imagine one of these great white steamers swinging into view. Paddle wheels gently slapping, whistle blowing, heading for the next summer landing here along the Hudson.
To order additional copies of Steamboats on the Hudson or the companion video Steamboats, the Fall River Line, please call 1-800-211-5934 or write to the address shown on the screen.